I want to welcome you all to the next panel, artificial intelligence, more broadly conceived, having to do with technology, thinking about technologies and terrorism. And this artificial intelligence as well as machine learning are the biggest sets of buzzwords in DC when it comes to emerging technologies, threats. It's all over the place. And I plan on asking the panelists, or hopefully they'll describe at some point what they mean by it, because it can mean many different things and it can be applied, and that's kind of the point, in many different areas. I guess to a little small smidget is that AI is a concept that machines can learn in a sense and perform tasks that might improve how they do other things in that way. And I can be corrected and be elaborated upon, and that's about as far as I'm going to go here. We're going to let the panelists and the experts deal with this. But what I wanted to think about more broadly also with regard to terrorism, we have all these new capabilities in the technology sphere, and there's kind of an incalculable a number of applications. The way it can be used, AI, machine learning, as a tool, a resource, and an aid for other capabilities of enhancing, almost in a sense, a multiplier effect of all of the other stuff that we've learned about CBRN, terrorism, cyber, and all of these spheres. So what I want to think about is not just also how we can use it if we get a chance in this discussion from the counterterrorism perspective, but also why might terrorists in that way or groups invest in some of those capabilities? Is there that much learning involved, and where might they do this? If it's about recruitment method, ways to recruit better, if it's about ways to gain financial resources, if it's about more lethal effects, if it's a critical infrastructure attacks, those types of things. And I want to think about that in terms of the way the choices that terrorists make, but also the choices that we make in terms of a counterterrorism community. Hopefully we're all included in that and not the former, of how we kind of identify and shift and allot those resources. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panel, but first introduce them. The first, and I'm going to be short on the intros because you have the bios, is Dr. Erica Briscoe. She's the Chief Technology Officer at Georgia Tech Research Institute, a research scientist and a chief lab scientist. Works on human behavior through computational means, computational social science, technology, language processing, prediction, and works on with the intersection of international affairs and psychology and tons of neat and interesting things, very well accomplished. We have my colleague, we're all actually colleagues in a different sense of different variations, but specifically in the school as a faculty member, David Muchlinski. He recently joined us. We're very happy to have him there. Published some research on using some of these, using social media and machine learning to look at mass political violence, electoral violence, and develop also is working on a lot of quantitative forecasting and issues such as when to predict these things like genocides and other aspects of mass political violence. And for the last, number third, and certainly not least, Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross. As self-described, and it's interesting because I hadn't looked at the bio before, but when we talked, I said, let me describe you, and it was very close except for the last one, as a scholar, a practitioner, entrepreneur, and that was actually first in my mind because this is the first time we had met, but I had watched his career and watched how many different things he's done in the terrorism field, counterterrorism, CVE, and done all of those things. So I think it's quite, describes him well. And now he has his own consulting company and a couple spin-offs, Valens Global, and he'll talk a little bit about that and kind of wrap it up for us in the panel. So I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. Briscoe and let you guys enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, thanks. A little bit of a setup asking the first speaker to define AI, but that's okay. So I think the definition that was just provided holds. I think as practitioners, we see a little bit of a distinction between machine learning and AI. Machine learning being a set of computational methods, statistically based, where AI is a more general term, more just intelligent systems. To add to that confusion, of course, especially in DC, you hear the term cognitive thrown out a lot, which I hate, absolutely hate that term, because usually that means something like adaptive or machine learning based approaches for some particular application. But I think cognitive should be held a little bit more for human inspired intelligence, but that's just me. So I took, when I was composing this set of slides, I really took the title, The Future of Terrorism, seriously, and that word future, meaning I really don't have a lot of technical work that I'm presenting here. I'm really thinking about, how AI will intersect or affect terrorism in the future. So a lot of what I have in the slides are just about sort of questions and topics for discussion. So I'll go through just a little bit of considerations and then domains and applications, and partially because of the place I hold here at GTRI, I get exposure to AI in a lot of different domains, and so that's kind of what I'm bringing up. There's many domains that AI will affect, but these are the ones I find critical in terms of how terrorism might be affected. So I'll start with a little bit of this. I think people have hit on this throughout the day a little bit, but what does AI do and how might terrorism be affected by it? And I think these are sort of the four main categories that AI might provide that affect terrorism. And so first, of course, is speed. This was mentioned earlier. AI properly implemented means that we can do things faster. We can get to an effect faster, and that has a lot of implications, not just for being more effective, but also for shortening the decision-making time and when we're acting in certain environments, whether that's the adversary or that's our side or the blue side. Distance, I think, is a really important and one of these meaty topics. Distance is important for many reasons. So one is just the obvious, distance. So you can have an effect at a greater distance. You don't need the humans, just like gunpowder allowed people to get further apart when they fought. AI can allow for a much greater distance. But the implications there are greater than just geographical. They're very much tied heavily to the ethical considerations. So when you remove sort of the human in the loop and the person being there, the distance implies a whole different calculus of ethics. And I think that's a really neat, interesting area for research and something that we have to consider when we're talking about terrorism. Accuracy, I won't spend too much time on because accuracy is, we can be more accurate. Again, more accurate, less risk, and less error when we build applications. And then unpredictability. I think unpredictability is another one like distance that's a really neat topic because we have, more than decades of research into psychology and social science that for the most part, we have not figured out humans at all. But we have a lot of work towards it. So we do understand why humans do things. We understand, what drives them in terms of their needs, and et cetera. And so we have a basic set of principles. And so when we're trying to understand like terrorist or radicalization, we can turn to those principles, at least in part. But when we start talking about AI, we kind of lose that physics or that sort of basic set of principles. And so it really makes the world a lot more unpredictable. And that's where things get kind of chaotic and scary. So these are a couple of research areas I hit, and again, I'm just bringing up topics in each one of these research areas I think considerations for terrorism. So the first one's sensors, and here we do, at Georgia Tech at large, and especially GTRI, we do a lot of work with different types of sensors. And so for the most part, especially with machine learning, it's really just an arms race. Who can create the better sensor, the more accurate sensor, and then who's the next guy who can do it. And then on top of that, who can counter that, who can spoof it, who can jam it, et cetera. And that's kind of the mode we've been operating in for a while. But now with AI, especially with machine learning-based techniques, and that's an example of one we use on the top right there, we have different ways of sort of injecting or corrupting our sensors. So for example, you probably heard the term adversarial AI, and that's where you're not building a physical thing to jam it or to spoof it. You're just messing with the training data, which can give you completely different answers and totally destroy accuracy. And again, that's sort of a new vector for a terroristic act. Just by messing with training data. And there's lots of examples of how you can do this, everything from wearing sunglasses and just different kind of things you wouldn't necessarily, or at least don't look like traditional sort of countermeasures for sensors. Of course, with the ubiquity of computing, we're not just talking about one sensor, so we're talking about whole suites of sensors. So we have, you hear a lot about China having cameras everywhere, but with, sensors being in everything, sort of like the Internet of Things, we're not just facing, the effect of having to deal with just one sensor, but really a whole comprehensive set. And that's really in the future, then we're talking about not just improving with machine learning a particular sensor, But because we're looking at this whole set, we're talking about bigger executive AI functions, and I call it executive because it is somewhat like how the brain manages a human sensing modalities. So you don't have to think about, what you're smelling or what you're seeing. Your brain kind of handles it autonomously, and that's sort of where we're moving in the future, where we'll have suites of sensors, and this has grand implications, not just for how we find people or nefarious actors, but also for how we can standardize or manipulate these sort of executive functions so as to preserve things like civil liberties and privacy. Robotics and autonomy is another huge area that we do a lot of work of here, and probably is the one that most people think of when they think of AI. And here, I think there's just a lot of trade-off between, what tools and what mechanisms can be used against us, or which ones are more for the greater good. So things like, robots for detecting IEDs, as opposed to putting guns on, UASs in the sky and removing the human from actually, having to commit the act of killing people. So that's a huge question. And as we talked about earlier, along with that comes these huge questions of if a robot or an autonomous system is committing acts, who is responsible? Is it the government that made it? Is it the person who launched it? And where does responsibility lie? And how does the public sort of perceive that responsibility? And how does it affect, one, how we respond to our government and how we sort of coordinate in our population in general as these things become more and more ubiquitous? The third one here, radicalized robots versus human AI interaction. So as we're very far from AI becoming anything near the sentient creatures that humans are. But there is the same way that we can sort of corrupt training data, we could corrupt AI in general. And I think the sort of balance there is, as we're doing research and developing these techniques or these technologies, being very cognizant of how the humans interact with them. And that's a little bit more than just explainable AI, which is another term you hear a lot about, but really what that interaction looks like as AI becomes more and more integrated within our society. And with all of this becomes, all the questions are the oversight. Who has oversight? Who does set the laws for robotics? And part of that as well, because the commercialization of technology is widespread, how do we prioritize the security, not just so it's resilient to hacking, but resilient to being turned against and used on the offensive. So the next two topics, information and social science. So information we've heard a lot about today. We hear a lot about it in social, looking at things like social media. I do a lot of work in this area, and I'm very excited about it. So I think, to me, that for the future, again, looking at the future, the sort of scary and most relevant to terrorism is the fact that as information operations are being carried out, propaganda, media campaigns, whatever you want to call them, I would say for the most part, we're sort of, and this is just general, everyone, is sort of still caught in the dark ages of how these things are carried out. But as we have new technology, and especially technologies, things like social bots, we really have new attack vectors here. And I'm really, because I like to research it, I think really the gains that can be had either by our side or on non-state actor side is creating much more theoretically, especially psychologically theoretically motivated methods. So we're not just seeing the dumb retweets that are obvious like campaigns or spins, but really almost like long cons, very coordinated, long carried out campaigns to change people's beliefs, not immediately, but over time. And things like that, to me, those are sort of the future, what's going to be possible and are be very hard to detect. And along with that are things like deep fakes. So again, it's easy. We build bot detectors. We know how they work for the most part, but we know how to capture bots for the most part. But as we get into very credible and realistic looking AI that looks and acts like humans, especially with video and imagery, with deep fakes, it's going to get harder and harder. And that's where we're going to really see the threat be realized. Insider threats, won't talk much about that, but again, our our possibility of terrorism is not just elsewhere, it's at home as well. And methods for AI for detecting that, AI for detecting insider threats, especially as they become increasingly powerful, and also for what methods they will be using are an incredible area that I think we need a lot more attention. And then lastly here, hybrid kinetic and non-kinetic warfare. And so this is one thing I don't hear too much about, especially in DC, and I'm surprised by. So the idea here is how can AI be used to coordinate effects? And that is to say, we see media campaigns, we see, military action in different places. But we're getting to the point where, especially with the psychological motivation, if these things come together, that campaigns can cross different modalities. So we might, for example, have ships show up somewhere in an ocean, a contested part of the world. At the same time, a media campaign goes on. At the same time, a chemical weapon is tested somewhere else. And these sort of coordinated effects across modalities really stand to change the way that people are able to shape the world and shape their messaging that comes out, especially following those effects. And to me, that's another area that's super scary in terms of what could happen for terroristic acts, and are pretty much don't require as much sophistication as I think we realize. So last area I'll cover quickly is the science of social science. And this is really more basic researchy, but I think this is the coolest area. And so the idea here for a long time, when I first got into looking at terrorism, when I first came to G2I, what we were trying to do is talk to people who talked to terrorists, who understood them. We came up with computational models for how they worked, what made them do what they did. Why do some people have the beliefs but not act on them? How can we understand all these things? And it's really hard, and the models are never right, and basically they just become case studies, and you're wanting for more. But right now we're really at, to me, a precipice for social science, and that it is driven by AI. And this can help us understand not how to thwart terrorists or what they're doing, but why they are who they are, what makes them tick, and how can we counter that. And so I call that a new social science because part of that social includes AI. So again, once we have a more heterogeneous society where AI is a part, we have to understand and study people and what they do within that society. And this also allows us, the AI allows us for better behavioral studies. So we've talked a lot, or we've heard a lot about studying social media, how campaigns work, and that's great. And a lot of the machine learning that goes on those studies and those data sets has helped us understand people better. But even more importantly, it helps, we're reaching the point where we can actually build better applications. And those applications, and this is an example of one on the right that we just built, where we're using AI to go out and to read newspapers, to read textbooks, to read journal publications. And those journal publications are on social psychology and clinical psychology. And they allow us to build computational models such that we can try to understand why people are doing what they're doing without people having to come in the room and just talk about it. And a second part of that, and this is very relevant to studying terrorist organizations, is understanding how things, even physically, are built. So if we know that a certain organization prefers this sort of method of attack, then we can use our intelligence data and use our understanding of physics and time and space and sort of put together in a reasoned about sense motifs or themes that we look for, so that we can say, hey, this group usually operates this way. So without us ever having to do anything, our AI can go out and sort of sample the world and say, hey, we're noticing things here that we expect to be a pattern that we should look at. So last slide, the future, as I've said, I think AI is, it's not just machine learning. It is really this multidisciplinary AI becoming more and more social science motivated, which is great. And it's great in that it helps us understand people, and it's great in that we have to have that to understand the emergent behavior that will happen as AI becomes more and more integrated within our society. As always, I have to put the caveat that we have a really hard time balancing privacy and civil liberties when we're talking about using AI, and that's a huge area that, as we're studying and as we're developing technologies, these considerations have to go hand in hand. And I already mentioned adaptive security. put an horizon right here just because I was doing these slides yesterday while watching the NSF presentation about the black hole. So, but I really do think we're seeing an event horizon. So when we talk about or we think about a future world where we have AI embedded within our society and we are interacting autonomously and the world is just a very different place. It's very hard to see or to understand what that world will look like. And I think it's an exciting time, but in terms of terrorism, it's also chaos, leads to opportunity. And so I think, the more cognizant we can be in the areas I outlined, the better off we'll be in terms of thwarting, threatening or terroristic activity in the future. Thanks.
All right, so with apologies to Leo DiCaprio, this is the title of a work that I and some of my colleagues had been working on for a while, using a various type of machine learning algorithm called a deep neural network to measure instances of violence around election times using an alternative source of data that we feel was sort of is underutilized in the realm of political science at this time, and that's basically social media. So we were looking to understand, can we use something like social media? Are people in different countries reporting on violent events that happen using Twitter, using Facebook? Can we get access to this data? And then if we have access to it, can we use that data to actually develop empirical estimates of the number of incidences of violence that occur in specific times in specific countries? So this work doesn't explicitly deal with terrorism, but you could sort of understand the applications to something like the study of terrorism so in terrorism, with our data, for instance, we know absolutely nothing about the majority of terrorist plots that are foiled. So we have this problem with our data sets to where we have probably undercounted the number of events that were actually likely to have occurred. And if we have some alternative source of data that's, say, for instance, social media, or people are reporting on instances of terrorism that are occurring, we might be able to develop more empirically accurate estimates of that type of violence. Or we can imagine sort of, I'll talk about sort of the implementation and the details of this study. So this is sort of a nuts and bolts presentation of how AI or how machine learning actually works to measure these concepts. But you can imagine kind of shrinking this kind of platform to sort of some sort of handheld device where you can embed it with a military unit who is plopped onto the ground in, say, Fallujah or something, and immediately has access to incoming streams of data from, say, terrorist social media feeds, insurgent forces social media feeds. They are using this type of data to understand, are there insurgents present in this area where we have been inserted? How many of them are there? How well armed are they? What kind of fight are we up against? So these are some of the implications of some of this AI as far as sort of the study of terrorism and these sorts of things go. So we wanted to really sort of understand, as part of this project, is for instances of violence in political science, including terrorism, counterterrorism, there's two problems. We have, first of all, we need to retrieve the information in order to have that in our data sets. So we need an accurate estimate of the number of events that have occurred. And then once we have that stream of data, we need to mine that data stream, whether it's social media or newspaper text or what have you, for the relevant events that have occurred. So we have some stream of text from a newspaper, from social media, and we need to figure out keywords in that stream of text, say, for instance, bombing or assassination or violence or these other types of words, to try and discover events of violence that have occurred. And then using social media, we think, gives us access to reporting streams of these kind of events that might tend to be underreported on by other sources of mainstream text as data, say, for instance, major newspaper organizations. And I'll present some evidence here that might actually be true. So with artificial intelligence now, we know that with the collection of this data, AI is above and beyond the ability of humans to actually code this information accurately just by having teams of people sit down and go through news reports and say this event did or did not happen. The only question now is sort of which of these platforms do we choose? And so this presentation is really sort of specific to electoral violence, but as I noted, right, this method is sort of general and can be applied to sort of any applicable task where you're sort of dealing with an unknown number of events and you just sort of want to estimate what has occurred from some text in front of you, whether that be social media or any other source of text. So for the purposes of our project, we've defined electoral violence just simply as coercive force directed towards electoral actors, be it voters or members of the opposition or candidates, or electoral objects such as polling places or voting booths or the ballots themselves, that occurs directly within the context of electoral competition. So this is used by states, first of all, the state governments to punish voters or to punish members of the opposition, or as vote suppression. And it may be, as in the case in Kenya in 2007, where you had massive protests and massive interethnic violence following the results of an election, the opposition may call for violence to protest the results of some of these elections that they deem to have been conducted unfairly. So there's inherent in this definition is sort of a temporal link between elections and violence. That's relatively easy to measure, right? There's an electoral period. Did the violence occur during this electoral period? Then there's a causal link, that is this instance of violence, would it have still occurred if this election was not actually going on? And that's actually much more difficult to measure. Do we know that, say, for instance, the violence between, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines and the government would still have occurred in the absence of the election in that country, or if the election, does this violence have sort of electoral roots? So most data, when trying to measure this type of violence, really sort of assumes this causal link. But these data are generally aggregated at some type of level where it's kind of a 0-1 binary indicator. Was this election violent? Was it not really violent? So we don't really know, based on whether or not that incident is coded as a 0 or a 1, whether or not that election was actually violent or if that violence was related to the election. And so we can use event data that have been developed by other sort of AI platforms. Say, for instance, the IQ's data that's now available for a lot of work in political science. But a lot of these events, at least with regard to election violence, are not really all that deadly. So they don't tend to get picked up by major international news organizations. So they're suffering from some sort of reporting bias. And so we want to sort of develop some sort of platform based in AI, based in machine learning, that can recover the actual empirical number of events that have actually occurred. So we can see if these elections are actually more violent than they are actually popularly portrayed in the media. So by now, right, the first 2 points I've sort of covered in some detail. And if we're going to measure something like election-related violence, we want to measure it accurately. We want to ensure that our measurements are valid. So how do we do that? And the other reason why we want to measure this concept as accurately as possible is we want to understand really sort of how this is being used. Is electoral violence the same in Ghana as it is in the Philippines? Or is it the same as in Venezuela as it is in the United States? Are the same actors engaging in it? Are they engaging in violence that is functionally the same? Are they doing it for the same reasons? Or are these different instances sort of unique? So this is sort of taken 2 tweets from, that came in from our data streams. One is from the election in the Philippines, and the other is reported on by AFP from the election, 2015 election in Venezuela. They both report on exactly the same type of events. The one in the Philippines focuses on the assassination of what we would identify as a local, basically, councilwoman, whereas the one from the one from Venezuela focuses on the assassination of a national opposition figure. So these 2 events are functionally equivalent. They're the assassination of politicos in various countries during the elections. The only problem is one is likely to be covered in major international news organizations. In fact, it was by AFP and the New York Times. The other one is not likely to be picked up by these same organizations, but they're functionally equivalent events. So this poses a problem if we're going to try and measure this kind of violence in these various countries. Why should Luis Manuel Diaz basically get pride of place when he is assassinated, but this local Filipina councilwoman sort of be forgotten to history? So of course, this project was undertaken in 2015, right before the election of Donald Trump and the associated sort of realization that social media can become a weapon in the right hands, and the corresponding disinformation campaigns. We did not take steps to correct for that in our initial research design, but later on, when we became aware of these things, we chose to carefully validate our data against more well-established sources of data to actually ensure that we weren't being duped by nefarious data. So we had kind of a three-stage data collection process where we collected our tweets with a keyword search, then we transformed these tweets into numeric values using a particular software called Word2Vec. And then we're using our machine learning platforms to then predict which words in these tweets are then actually going to be predictive of violent events. So there's only some words in these tweets that are actually going to be, that are going to tell our machine basically that yes, something violent has occurred. So these are the elections for which we gathered our data. And this is basically sort of how we did it. So we make a number of queries to the Twitter API, which then goes out and collects a series of tweets every day. These tweets are then merged into one larger pool of tweets, which the authors of our study, including myself, we then went through and basically hand-coded whether or not these tweets were actually referencing some type of electorally violent event or not. And then those became our data sets that we were using for the training of our neural network. So this is sort of how our natural language processing model works. Normally, when we think of words as features of data, we just kind of think, is this word present in this particular document or not? So we can just take this same tweet that I showed you earlier, decompose it into basically ones or zeros, where 1 is the word is present, 0 the word is not present. Rather, what we think we want to do is measure how human beings actually use language a little bit more accurately. This is a method called word embeddings, which basically puts some context window around our linguistic features, and basically chooses to focus on a particular word or a particular couple of words in that tweet, and then model the probability of that particular word occurring in some broader linguistic context. So for instance, we might want to think that the word dead is indicative of violence, and that word dead is going to sort of appear more frequently in other contexts where, you know, there are also words like, say for instance, shot at close range, right? If you're going to get shot at close range, you're most likely going to end up dead. And then this is just sort of simply a visual representation of that. So we see that our linguistic model is basically sort of clustering words that have sort of similar meanings into various clusters that are close together. So words that mention violence tend to co-occur more frequently, so they get clustered together, whereas those words are then separated in distance from words that are not violent. So we use that model to then train our AI, our neural network, which basically sort of looks like this. If we just take a simple tweet that says basically we have 10 people that have been killed in election day violence, basically sort of decomposes that into just a series of strings that are then passed through this network. It does a series of complex mathematical operations that I won't get into, but basically at the end we just want to have basically a tweet that says if there are 10 people dead in election day violence, what's the probability that this tweet references violence, essentially. That's all this thing is doing at the end of the day, even though it's fairly mathematically complex. So we've gotten our data on how well our neural network is doing. We want to see if this is sort of state of the art. So we compare this to another form of AI or another machine learning algorithm called a support vector machine that has previously been used to do this kind of exact same task. I won't get into sort of what these metrics substantively mean here, but our neural network that's shown in red is bigger. Our score is bigger than the one for the support vector machine, basically demonstrating that our algorithm is a more accurate classifier of tweets that actually represent violence or not. So we're actually recovering a much bigger number of tweets that are referencing violence. But how do we go from the number of tweets that reference violence to the number of events. We want to use some clustering algorithm. So this is just a table showing the larger number of tweets that our neural network algorithm has identified. This is a large number, it's about 45,000. So we've identified 45,000 more tweets in the support vector machine that reference violence. Out of those 45,000 tweets, how many more actual violent events do we discover? So it happens that we discover 15 more violent events in Venezuela, 13 more in the Philippines, and 3 more in Ghana. So we're actually counting a greater number of events that actually have happened. We know that they've happened because we went through basically and hand-coded those events according to just their tweet, basically, headlines. Some of them were, the vast majority of them were related to violence, some were not. So some reported on, the killings of policemen in drug deals in the Philippines gone bad. That's clearly not related to the election. But when the NPP and the NCC, or the NDC, attacked each other in Ghana during political rallies, those are clearly related to the election. And if you just sort of look at this table here, what's just sort of apparent is that our neural network is actually recovering is actually more accurate in assessing the causal relationship of these events to the electoral process itself. And it's actually doing a better job in doing this than most hand-coded data sets that are supposed to be measuring these sorts of events that are actually coded by humans themselves. So the machine is actually doing a better job than us, which is perhaps not surprising, but at least gives us hope that our results are externally valid. So just to briefly wrap this up. So we know we can use AI basically to assess methods of political violence used by state and non-state actors, and that social media can actually assist us in doing this. But of course, this method is dependent on a few factors, namely social media and the internet, which are not applicable everywhere. So we had, for instance, some of our weakest results in Ghana, where only 10% of the population are actually using social media. So perhaps it's not surprising there that we just didn't get, a whole lot of extra water out of that particular stone. But in countries where social media use and internet penetration are high, this is a particularly useful medium through which to assess the number of violent events that are actually going on in a particular area. So you can think, some broadly where we're sort of thinking of going with this is that you can monitor the social network accounts of various insurgent organizations or other types of violent organizations and understand how they're using this type of violence, where they're using it, how they're acting strategically in their applications of these kinds of things. We can do this kind of analysis across sort of different terrorist groups as well, from jihadi groups to homegrown white nationalist extremists. Are they talking about different things? Do they have different understandings of violence? Are the types of violence that they're talking about then actually useful in predicting how they're going to act later on down the road when they eventually do carry out their attacks? So, thank you very much.
All right, I win an award for shortest PowerPoint at the conference. First of all, what an excellent conference this was. This was put on really thoughtfully. I've been to a lot of conferences, and this one was really special for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, just the range of people and voices I haven't heard before, the mix of experienced scholars and younger scholars. This was really thoughtfully put together. So Dr. Bloom and your crew, who are all super likable, hats off to you for putting on an extraordinary conference. And I'd actually, since I'm the last speaker before the keynotes, I'm taking a moment to thank my host, which I almost never do because I like launching right into my speech. But I'd like to take a second to also recognize Carissa Goodwin, because she has the most thankless task, which is taking care of all of our logistics and making sure that things are running smoothly, which is really hard to do. And you did a superb job. So thank all of you for having us here. So Jim Dater said, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And I think that's an important statement when we're looking at how technology intersects with terrorism moving forward. If you actually look back at some of the most prescient work from, say, the 1990s on what the impact of the internet would be, it's from some of the least likely, least credible sources you'll find. I was really grateful that my colleague Gary Ackerman, who's one of the smartest people, I think, in our field, came up working independently with a very similar adoption curve to mine on how VNSAs, which is an acronym for violent non-state actors, adopt technologies. Obviously, not all technologies used by militant groups will get in the same way. So what I wanted to look at is, how is it when a VNSA adopts a new technology, how is it that it looks? What are the phases that it goes through? And all of this leads to where we are with the artificial intelligence panel. If you look at 2 of the 3 previous panels, those are panels about technologies that VNSAs have adopted. We've been through the adoption curve. We haven't really with CBRN. It's possible with CBRN that it's not going to happen either. There are a lot of technical barriers. But the first 2 panels, that's where we've actually seen an adoption curve used in ways that I think are predictable in hindsight. But at the time, if you pay attention to how people are analyzing VNSA adoption of technology, we get it wrong because we don't understand what's going on. So here's my fundamental argument. My fundamental argument is that we should understand VNSA adoption of technology the same way we understand businesses, startup firms in particular, adopting and putting forward new technologies. Because if you understand kind of the logic of startups, and I think violent non-state actors are the startups of the political organizing space. If you understand the logic of startups, it's to get a product out to the market. There's this kind of stupid logic of fail fast and pivot, which it's arguable, but that's what they tend to do. So you'll have a lot of iteration before there's a successful adoption of whatever it is that the firm is bringing out to market. So Twitter, for example, quite famously started as a music file sharing business. And then iTunes came out and they realized that they were screwed unless they did something different. So if we understand violent non-state actors using technology the same way, we'll have a better understanding of where they come along on the curve. Now, for artificial intelligence, what this panel is on, we will see terrorists use artificial intelligence. I think that the reason why that's as predictable as that they will use drones more is because when you look at both of those markets, the same thing is happening. The drone market is exploding, it's proliferating, and drones are becoming way better as consumer technology, which makes them much more adaptable, which magnifies the different threat vectors and ways that VNSAs can adapt them. Likewise, artificial intelligence is becoming consumerized. And I think the way that it will be used is less predictable. But the fact that it will be used, I think, is predictable. So here's the curve, and I want to actually talk about it in the context of the first 2 panels, in the context of drones and in the context of cyber terrorism, specifically social media and the way that one of the figures, Laith al-Khoury, talked about, Junaid Hussain, and his, specifically his predecessors as well, utilized what we can call the virtual plotter model of terrorist attacks. So these are the 4 stages. Early adoption, and there's a fairly high failure rate during the early adoption phase. Then we get to the iteration phase, where it's up and down. Sometimes they're succeeding a bit, sometimes they're failing, but that's a phase where we often lose sight of what they're doing. We freeze what they're doing in time and say, well, here's an inherent limitation, and we don't understand what's coming. Part of the reason we don't understand is because not only are we freezing their usage in time, we're freezing technology in time. And not understanding the way technology can iterate rapidly and massive opportunities that VNSAs have to adapt this technology to their purposes. So that's the iteration phase. Then you get to a breakthrough phase. That's where suddenly they're on their game. ISIS's drones, ISIS's use of the virtual plotter model. But then you have a competition. We call it competition to analogize it to business, right? In other context, this would be when MySpace breaks through and suddenly there's all these social media platforms and they get displaced by Facebook. Or where Blockbuster breaks through and it dominates the home video market, and then suddenly you get Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. Like, that's the competition phase. And this is the phase where state actors or other actors, like social media companies, understand what VNSAs are up to, they adapt, VNSA effectiveness declines. Really, I would term it a question mark, because we don't know what happens next. The world of much faster technological innovation, where for social media, for drones, there's a whole story to be told. The same will be true of artificial intelligence. So if you go through those phases, just to quickly point to this, it was said earlier by Dr. Krebs that we thought of drones originally as simply being the province, we thought of armed and unarmed drones. And armed drones were the province of states. And if you look at what was then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now it's called ISIS. But if you look at their initial use of drones, they looked so stupid, right? Like, you had militants that were throwing drones in the air, and they looked like paper airplanes. They fly up for 30 feet, up, and it was hilarious, right? Like, you couldn't think of this being a game-changing technology. And let me specify, it isn't yet, but the number of usages being made is off the charts. The early panel on drones focused specifically on terrorist use of drones in attacks. But if you magnify it a little bit, and you look at all the various usages that not only ISIS, but also cartels and gangs south of the United States make of drones, you understand how valuable they are. ISR. Propaganda. There's vectoring. So indirect fire has become more lethal, in part because drone footage allows you to understand where a mortar is going, right? Like those, when I was in Iraq in 2007, if you were on a base and a mortar was coming in, it wasn't going to hit you. You'd run for cover, but it was so inaccurate. When you have a drone flying overhead so that you understand where mortar fire is going, suddenly what's indirect fire can become, not hyper accurate, but quite a bit more direct. There's multiple usages that can be made and are being made. Now, you get to the competition phase after what we've seen of ISIS doing with drones, dropping grenades in the Battle of Mosul and the like, and suddenly there's more counter-UAS technology. We don't know what's going to happen next. Counter-UAS technology is powerful, but it also has its limitations because right now it's hard to effectively deploy counter-UAS technology without also knocking airplanes out of the sky, which generally speaking we don't want to do. Likewise for social media. Early adoption on social media, I would say, is Anwar al-Awlaki, right? Like Awlaki was super good. He was very theologically trained, and suddenly he was showing up in way more terrorist plots than we'd seen of any figure previously. But there was a clear limitation. These were what I think it would be accurate to call these attacks lone wolf attacks. They were inspired, they weren't connected to the organization, and they can be disruptive, but ultimately these guys who were inspired by Awlaki weren't that good, and they weren't actually helping Al-Qaeda to advance its strategy for the most part. Then you get the next iteration, right? You move from YouTube, which was largely a one-way medium, right? You have the Awlaki videos. He had his own blog, but it wasn't as interactive as you'd get with Junaid Hussain and the early ISIS guys, where you have this daily interaction with thousands of people who are potential recruits, who could be radicalized, who could be spurred to action, and the like. And suddenly Junaid Hussain, who's kind of a bozo, right? Like, he was part of a hacking team, but he wasn't that good of a hacker. He didn't know anything about operational security. He wasn't as smart as Awlaki. He wasn't as charismatic. And he kind of looked like a failure, right? This is the iteration phase. He looked like a failure. He was getting everyone he was talking to arrested. If you look at Junaid's people he got arrested, it's obvious that there were a lot of problems with what he was doing. Even though he used encryption, he used it inconsistently. Like, he used encryption in the same way that US government leakers use encryption when they're talking to the media, which is like, you're talking openly, and then say, hey bro, let's go to encryption. Well, guess when they're talking about the plot? It's when you go to encryption. So ultimately, he wasn't very successful in that respect. But he was successful in another respect, which is if you look at Ali at his height and Junaid Hussain at his height, one who's kind of a joker, and they're radicalizing people at about the same rate because the medium had changed, right? So you go from the guy who's the best at it to someone who doesn't have great skills, and he's successful in one way. He is radicalizing people even though he's getting them arrested. So Junaid Hussain gets killed, and then you have another generation of virtual plotters, right, who are basically trying to take it in the argument and do everything that old terrorist networks would do. And then you get guys like Rashid Qasim, and suddenly you're in the breakthrough phase. Now, past that phase, right? Twitter pulled these accounts down. Facebook pulled these accounts down. And even though they can go to other, to other platforms, they don't have the same ubiquity of people that they can interact with. Will they adapt to this? So the story's yet to be told. Artificial intelligence. What Dr. Briscoe put forward, I kind of independently made my own notes on what we're likely to see in terms of terrorist use of AI. And there's autonomous drone swarms, which I think is one thing I would look for as a possibility. One thing I would add to Dr. Briscoe's breakdown of what AI can do is also information. Like we may see terrorists use very effectively AI in the information sphere. So if you look at when ISIS would capture cities, they usually would use a human intelligence network ahead of time. You could instead go to social network mapping, and using AI to advance that in order to put in place all the intel of who you need to capture and kill in order to take over a city. Likewise, automation of social engineering attacks is another way that we may see AI used by terrorists. Other areas that Dr. Briscoe put forward, I think, represent just improvement over current efforts, but in an extension that's the same direction. So being able to shoot further, more accurately. And I think deepfakes is something else I had written down. Dr. Briscoe talked about that. I think that that's also something we're much more likely to see from a state. But I think that VNSAs eventually will use deepfakes as well, in part because for a VNSA to use a deepfake effectively, it doesn't have to fool the experts. All they have to do is fool their target audience. So soldiers desecrating a Quran or whatever, these can be powerful images, even being in a theater. And Dr. Rubin and I were talking before this panel. We had kind of the illusion that we would get through these presentations quickly, but we're all doing our lot. What we've talked about in this conference is how militant groups, terrorist guys, will use technology. And what these panelists point to is that this problem set is going to become more challenging. Technology affects everything that we do. Technology certainly affects our field in ways that are invisible to us. I think the gravitation of analysis to social media has had a profound impact on our field in ways that are mainly negative, that are kind of invisible to us, including the increased personalization of these disputes. One of the things we need to work towards is allowing the ridiculous to exist a bit more. We may bet against the ridiculous. We may say this is unlikely. We probably aren't going to see, you may say, terrorists use CBRN successfully. It's just too hard. But consider them bets. You may bet heavily, but what you use is space for understanding just how unpredictable the future is. Because if you look back on where we've been for the past, say, 10 years, and the analytic accuracy of a number of predictions that people assured you would be true, and that anyone who disagreed had to be an idiot, like those consensus views are often wrong. And I think for us to really anticipate what's coming, we need to move to a system that's quite a bit more both accepting of alternative lines of analysis and also doing a good job of contextualizing probabilities and looking backwards and say, okay, we all placed down our bets. Where did things come down? Because that ultimately, in my view, is the way that we as a field can increase our value. Thank you.
Well, you can tell I'm in a rush, but it was mostly because I wanted to capture all the last few moments and get a few questions before we break of this excellent panel. I know you have tons of questions. We are going to extend it to about, I think we're going to break about five or 6 minutes, so we have a 10-minute kind of stretch before we do the keynote. So let me a couple questions, and I'm sure the panelists will be actually perfectly happy to answer questions at the break if we need to go a little further into that. So I will open the floor up for you guys. Yes, sir.
Sam Rising, master's student here at Georgia Tech. Thank you all for your comments today. I had a comment for all three, or a question for all three of you. So we talk a lot about artificial intelligence and terrorism. Whereas I wonder if we could shift to the counterterrorism side and using artificial intelligence to monitor, track, and potentially disrupt radicalization and terrorist activities. One of the things we notice is how valuable the private sector is in developing and maintaining these kinds of technologies. But we also see that there seems to be some friction between the private sector and the public sector in terms of the ethical use of this technology. So I was wondering if you were optimistic at all about that relationship and how the public sector might be able to engage some folks in the private sector to leverage this technology for counterterrorism purposes.
Thank you, and please see me after the panel for your payment. It just so happens that my company, Valens Labs, is working on this precise issue. This is one of the two companies that I run. It's the AI-focused company. What our initial platform, Project Mercury, is designed to do is to measure future trends in terrorism in a way that can rationalize defense, especially for corporate actors. So it's right now in the beta phase, but I'm pretty high on it for a variety of reasons. My chief engineer has a background in financial markets, where the AI that he's worked on is really top of the line. And we're using a recurrent neural network to measure, based on past terrorist patterns and patterns of innovation, what the risk bands that are faced in different geographic areas down to a very granular level. And secondly, when innovation will hop from one theater to another. That's all I'm going to say about my company. It's pretty cool. Where we are with artificial intelligence right now, in my personal opinion, is where we were with the internet in 1994. So you're hopping on Netscape and you're looking at kind of your read-only websites. Like, where artificial intelligence is going to be is just so far beyond where we are. Companies like Google, which worked on Project Maven and withdrew from it, I think Google is not set up to be a defense contracting company. And in contrast to the defense contractors of the World War II era, the defense industrial base, which was very patriotic, Google's very much a global company. And so its values are, it's very hesitant internally, both for market reasons and employee reasons, to kind of represent and kind of get behind building up the US military. I think if we look at what companies are going to be the ones that kind of will take the lead in AI, like ultimately, my view is that I want there to be a strong military. And I think that something like Project Maven, which makes drone warfare more accurate and less lethal to civilians, is a positive thing. I do not think it's a negative thing. I don't always agree with what the military does, but I do think that having a strong military as an American is important. So I think the companies that will take the lead, they may not even exist yet. I mean, it's possible that what will happen is that the Lockheeds and the Booz Allens will extend into this, and I think that would be terrible, because those companies, I think, have worked too long for the government, and they have replicated all of the government's inefficiencies. What my hope is that it's new companies that may not even exist, or that none of us would have heard of, that will end up taking the lead in terms of innovating AI in the defense sphere. But I will say that even though I believe in a strong US government, I also believe that while I disagree with where some of the AI ethics are with kind of the Google workforce that was rebelling against it, I also think there is a strong need to think through AI ethics, because there are some very thorny issues And things like, for example, fully autonomous weapons will benefit rogue states and will benefit terrorist groups much more than they benefit countries like the US and other countries I root for.
Just to follow up on that, I think I'm a little less optimistic, at least at this point in time, because like you said, I agree totally that we're kind of far off from the realizing the potential of AI. We're in the early days. From where we sit and the type of work we do, we're often called in because commercial products don't work. And they don't work usually for one reason, and that's because the companies build those products to make money. They have to survive. And because we are so in such a nascent area, there's a lot more research to be done to make these things work. And so right now I think it's we do use some commercial products, but often, especially if we can't get inside them and start tailoring them, we're kind of back to where we started. And so I think there's sort of a little contrast there, but as we get more mature, then much more of the commercialization will kind of take over from the government.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think that sort of as Larry said, right, like AI is sort of the buzzword among sort of all these companies in this particular field, but not all of them understand what AI does or how it works. There's kind of this misconception out there that AI is a magic bullet that'll solve whatever problem that you throw at it. So I was asked by a contractor while I was living abroad to develop a statistical model based in AI that would predict the number of planes that this guy would lose when he rented them out to various countries, because he rented them out to sort of countries that were at war, basically, and as a private individual, he didn't want to lose a lot of money. And so the first question I said, well, do you have any data on planes? No. Okay. How many planes have you lost? None. Well, okay, here's my prediction. You will lose no planes. Pay me 10,000 pounds and have a nice day. So it's kind of humorous, but in another sense, it's kind of sad because even the people who are supposed to be utilizing this technology really don't understand what it is supposed to do. They don't understand the mathematics or the statistics at a fundamental level. And until we have companies and defense contractors and militaries and what have you that understand what this stuff actually does, then it's not going to be. I'm not optimistic about its uses until we get to that stage.
Can I make a quick comment, just as a response to the question, and then I'm going to follow up with a question. Is that okay? Do we have time?
We actually, unfortunately, don't. We've got the keynote.
Comment and then.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I'll do the comments really quick. I actually worked on a project in 2010, 2011 that was actually on this very topic of predicting terrorist activity in potential conflict zones, where you see a lot of jihadists rising up every time there is some sort of civil war or political conflict or demonstrations. You see the opportunism by the jihadist elements to take advantage of that. So I had to develop a taxonomy of over 3,000 words that are used by jihadists at large. But the trickier part was actually giving sentiment analysis, or sentiment score, really more accurately, to each keyword. And it was about understanding what does that word mean to the jihadist community, not the other way around. It doesn't, it's not what it means to the United States or nation-state countries. It's more to so Osama bin Laden got a 5 out of 5, right? The United States got 1 out of 5, and so on. Running that data taxonomy of 3,000 words through 70 different languages with NLP capability for entity extraction to be able to predict any kind of potential conflict used where jihadists might exploit it. And sure enough, we got some interesting results during the attack on the US mission in Benghazi, which was interesting to see a spike of utilization of these words by the jihadist community in certain environments, spike up the night before and then die down the day after. And I know it was a simple model that's not exact science, but I think that is something that could be applicable to machine learning and AI in the future. But that was just my comment. Thank you.
So this is it's the most painful thing to have to cut off a discussion for that reason, but I want to give you guys a chance to go to the restroom and so forth. And also we're going to do a bigger thank you later because the amount of people we thank the list is long. I want to give first the audience a thank you for your attendance, your time, everything like this. And then secondly, a round of applause also for an excellent, incredible panelists who've given us so much to think about. So please be back in about 4 minutes so we can start at 5 on the dot. And we look forward to seeing you in a few minutes.